Hi everyone. The Boys in the Boat Summary by Daniel James Brown. Part 1. Enjoyed the video. Please subscribing to my channel for more great content like this. You'll be notified when I upload new videos. The Boys in the Boat by Daniel James Brown is a captivating narrative that tells the story of the University of Washington's 1936 eight-oar crew and their epic quest for an Olympic gold medal. The team was composed of sons of loggers, shipyard workers, and farmers who first had to master the harsh realities of the Great Depression. The book focuses on Joe Rantz, a teenager without family or prospects, who rose not for glory, but to regain his shattered self-regard and to find a place he can call home. The crew is assembled by an enigmatic coach and mentored by a visionary, eccentric British boat builder, but it is their trust in each other that makes them a victorious team. Here are some real examples from the book. Joe Rantz's struggles. Joe Rantz, who came from a working-class family, faced numerous hardships. His mother died when he was young, and his father abandoned him multiple times. Despite these challenges, Joe managed to maintain excellent grades and even made it onto the University of Washington's crew team. 2. The 1936 Berlin Olympics. The crew's ultimate goal was to compete in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Despite the political tension and the rise of Adolf Hitler, the team focused on their training and competition. 3. The team's success. The University of Washington's crew team, under the guidance of coach Al Ulbrichtson, made a name for itself on the national stage. They performed exceptionally well at various regattas and set new records. Chapter 1. Only 9 seats. Begins on October 9, 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression. The city of Seattle is described in detail, with men selling fruit for a few cents and long lines waiting for soup kitchens to open. This was the 4th year of the Great Depression, and a quarter of all working Americans were unemployed. On this day, 2 students, Roger Morris and Joe Rantz, walked across the quad at the University of Washington. They were both freshmen, tall and powerfully built. They took engineering classes together, but that afternoon, they were headed to a building near the Montlake Cut, the nearby canal. Inside the building, they registered to join the University of Washington freshman crew team. Joe Rantz, despite his good looks and athleticism, was less confident than Roger Morris. He hailed from a small town in the Olympic Peninsula, and he didn't feel that he fit in at college, where many of the students came from wealthy, big city families. At the time, the University of Washington didn't offer sports scholarships. Here are some analyses. 1. The Great Depression. The chapter provides a vivid description of the hardships faced by people during the Great Depression. It paints a picture of the grim reality of unemployment and poverty. 2. Roger Morris and Joe Rantz. The chapter introduces us to 2 key characters, Roger Morris and Joe Rantz. They are portrayed as strong and athletic, but Joe is shown to be less confident due to his background. 3. Joining the crew team. The chapter ends with Roger and Joe registering to join the University of Washington freshman crew team. This marks the beginning of their journey in the world of competitive rowing. Chapter 2. The Boy from the Farm. The chapter provides a detailed account of Joe's family background, his childhood experiences, and the series of unfortunate events that shaped his life. Joe was the second son of Harry Rantz and Nellie Maxwell. Harry was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, large in the hands and feet. He was a tinkerer and inventor, a dreamer of big dreams. In his spare time, he loved to work with his hands and build contraptions of all kinds. He even designed and built his own version of an automobile from scratch. Nellie Maxwell was a piano teacher and the daughter of a preacher. They had their first child, Fred, in 1899. 7 years later, looking for a place where Harry could make his mark on the world, they headed west from Pennsylvania, crossed the country, and settled down in Spokane, Washington. 1. Joe's early life. Joe was born in March of 1914 in a small frame house on the north side of the cold, clear Spokane River. The Rantz family moved into this house after they settled down in Spokane, Washington. The town was surrounded by ponderosa pine forest and open range country. The summers were crackling hot, the air dry and perfumed with the vanilla scent of ponderosa bark. Two family dynamics. In January 1922, Harry and Thula had a boy named Harry Jr., and the following year they had another son, Mike. With his family growing and more mouths to feed, Harry had to take a job at a gold mine in Idaho some 140 miles away. He'd work there during the week, then make the long drive home on the weekends. Life in Boulder City. When Joe was 9 years old, the family's house nearly burned down. Harry risked his life to save Nellie's old piano from the fire. Afterwards, Harry moved his family northeast to a Boulder City mining camp where he'd worked as a master mechanic. For many, the mining camp was a dismal place to live, but Joe loved it. Thula, however, despised her new home. She'd been raised to be sensitive and artistic, and she excelled at playing the violin. Now she felt ignored, and her hands were too cold to play an instrument. Chapter 3. 8,001 Small Things. Begins with the first day of practice for the University of Washington's freshman crew team. The chapter provides a detailed account of the physical and mental challenges of rowing. The chapter begins with a collection of facts and figures about the hopefuls, who were told to step onto scales, stand next to measuring sticks, and fill out forms detailing their medical backgrounds. The chapter introduces us to two key characters, Joe Rantz and Roger Morris. They were both freshmen, tall and powerfully built. They took engineering classes together, but that afternoon, they were headed to a building near the Montlake Cut, the nearby canal. Inside the building, they registered to join the University of Washington freshman crew team. The chapter also introduces us to the freshman coach, Tom Bowles, and the head coach of the rowing program, Al Ulbrichtson. Ulbrichtson was known as the least talkative man on campus. Some of the local sports reporters called him the man with a stone face. He did not like to show his emotions, but he knew the sport of rowing well. He had been the lead rower, or stroke oar, of a Washington crew that had won national championships in 1924 and 1926. Joe Rantz's tryouts. In the fall of 1933, Joe Rantz tried out for the crew team. Every afternoon he weighed in, got his assignment for which boat he'd be rowing with, and listened to Bowles lecture the freshmen about the difficulty of rowing. Bowles stressed that rowing was far more physically and intellectually demanding than football. Al Ulbrichtsen's ambition. Ulbrichtsen was studying the boys closely because he was thinking well beyond the upcoming season. The previous year had been a strong one for the Washington team. They defeated their arch-rivals from the University of California, then beat out the best crews the East had to offer, including Yale, Cornell, and Harvard. But Ulbrichtsen was not satisfied. In 1932, a crew from California had won Olympic gold. No Washington coach had ever even come close to taking a team to the Olympics. The next games were set to take place in Berlin, Germany, in 1936, and Al Ulbrichtsen didn't just want to get a crew there. He wanted to bring gold home to Seattle. The challenges ahead. To pull it off, the coach knew he was going to have to clear a series of imposing hurdles. He'd have to outsmart coach Kai Ebright, who was widely regarded as the intellectual master of the sport. Ebright had an uncanny knack for winning the big races, the ones that really counted. Ulbrichtsen needed to find a crew that could beat Ebright's best when it mattered most. Then that crew would have to outrace the top boats from the East at the Olympic trials. Finally, if they did earn the right to represent the United States, they'd face the best oarsmen in the world. They would have to beat the British, who had practically invented the sport, the Italians, who had nearly won in 1932, and the Germans, who, under the new Nazi system, were said to be building extraordinarily powerful and disciplined crews. Chapter 4 Life in Exile delves into the hardships faced by Joe Rantz during his early life. The chapter provides a detailed account of Joe's life after his family's home burned down, forcing them to move to a camp near the Idaho mine where his father worked. Here are some real examples from Chapter 4. 1. Life in Boulder City. After the fire, 9-year-old Joe and his family moved to the Boulder City camp near the Idaho mine where Joe's father worked. The camp consisted of 35 small cabins and a few other ramshackle buildings clinging to the side of a mountain. Wooden sidewalks stretched from one building to the next. A one-room schoolhouse stood on a flat spot among the pines, but there were few children, and attendance was low. To Thula, it was a dismal place, but to young Joe, Boulder City was a wonderland. 2. Joe's adventures. When his father operated the mine's huge steam shovel, Joe could perch happily on the rear end of the machine and ride it as it swung around in circles, almost like the carousel back in Spokane. His father built him a go-kart, and Joe dragged it up the steep roads to the top of the mountain. He pointed the cart downhill, climbed in, and released the brake. He raced down the road at breakneck speed, careening around the hairpin turns, whooping at the top of his lungs all the way to the river and across the bridge. 3. Joe's exile. One warm summer afternoon, Thula's tension and frustration finally boiled over. She was in the kitchen, shoving pans around the stovetop angrily, while Joe was outside, down on his hands and knees, working in his vegetable garden. That little garden plot was a sanctuary for him. He was in charge of it, not Thula, and it was a source of enormous pride. When he could bring a fresh basket of tomatoes or an armful of sweet corn into the cabin, and then see them on the dinner table at night, he felt that he was contributing. He felt he was helping Thula, maybe making up for whatever he might have done lately to annoy her. That afternoon, as Joe was working his way down row after row, pulling weeds, he turned around to find his 18-month-old brother following him. Mike was imitating Joe, only he wasn't pulling weeds. He was plucking half-grown carrots out of the ground. Joe turned and bellowed at him in rage. Mike unleashed a long, wailing scream. A moment later, Thula ran down the steps, red-faced and seething. She snatched Mike up from the ground, whisked him into the cabin, and slammed the door behind her. When Joe's father came home from work later that evening, Thula was waiting for him in the doorway. She demanded that he take Joe out back and whip him with a belt, but Harry merely took him upstairs and gave him a good talking to instead. Thula exploded. She declared that she would not live under the same roof as Joe, that Harry must choose between him and her. She said Joe would have to move out if she were to stay in such a godforsaken place. Joe was only 10 years old. Chapter 5 Making the Climb delves into the rigorous training and practice sessions that the University of Washington's freshman crew team underwent. The chapter provides a detailed account of the physical and mental challenges of rowing, the lessons imparted by the coaches, and the experiences of the boys as they prepared to row. 1. Daily practices. Every day after classes, Joe made the long trek down to the lake. He donned his jersey and shorts. He weighed in, like all the boys, so the coaches could make sure they weren't gaining too many extra pounds or training so hard that they lost too much weight. Each shell held 8 rowers, along with a coxswain, a smaller boy who directed their pace and steered the boat. At every practice, the boys were split into training crews, so Joe checked a chalkboard to see which group he was assigned to for the day. 2. Coach Bowles' lessons. The freshman coach, Tom Bowles, began each session with a talk. He changed his topic each day, but Joe had begun to notice 2 common themes. First, the boys heard time and again that rowing was difficult almost beyond imagining. In the months ahead, Bowles said, their bodies and moral characters would be tested. Only those who possessed near superhuman physical endurance and mental toughness would prove good enough to wear a W on their chests. By Christmas break most of them would have given up, Bowles said, perhaps for something less demanding, like football. 3. Training in Old Nero. Once Coach Bowles finished talking each day, they wrestled the long, white-bladed oars from their racks, carried them down to the water, and prepared to row. They were not remotely ready to step into a delicate, 62-foot-long racing shell. They would have capsized it and ended up in the lake. Instead, they waited turns to board the school's training barge, Old Nero. The vessel was wide and flat-bottomed, with a long walkway running down the middle and 8 seats for novice oarsmen on either side. All the rowers faced the back of the boat and sat on small seats that slid back and forth along greased runners. Since 1907, hundreds of hopeful freshmen at the University of Washington had learned the basics of rowing in that old barge. Now it was Joe's turn. For catching a crab. As they tried to absorb the lessons, they lived in constant fear of making any of the many mistakes Coach Bowles kept pointing out to them. One was particularly frightening. If the blade of their oar entered the water too deeply, at the wrong angle, or out of time with the others in their crew, or if it remained in the water too long, the oar would suddenly become stuck. This was known as catching a crab. When it happened, it felt as if some gargantuan crustacean had reached up from the depths and seized the blade. The boat kept moving, but the oar didn't. The boy who caught the crab might be smacked hard in the chest with the handle and knocked out of his seat. Or if he held on to the oar too long, he might be catapulted into the water. Every stroke he took offered each boy the possibility of a wet, cold, and spectacularly public form of humiliation. 5. Roger Morris experience. Out of all the freshmen, the only one who'd ever rowed before was Joe's friend Roger Morris. As a boy, he'd spent his summers rowing a small boat in Manzanita Bay, a lovely blue cove in western Washington. When he was 12 years old, he once rowed 15 miles from his family's cabin outside Seattle to their house in this city, all because he had a terrible toothache and wanted to get home and see his mother. But aboard Old Nero, Roger Morris discovered that his experience was no help. His freewheeling style of rowing was nothing like the precise racing stroke that Coach Bowles was trying to teach. Chapter 6, Another Chance at a Home, delves into the significant changes in Joe Rantz's life during the mid-1920s. The chapter provides a detailed account of Joe's family dynamics, his experiences at school, and the impact of the Great Depression on his family. 1. Moving to Sequim. In 1925, Harry Rantz had saved enough money to buy an auto repair and tire shop in Sequim, a small town northwest of Seattle. Sequim sat on a wide expanse of prairie between the snow-capped Olympic Mountains and the broad, blue waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The weather was dry compared to rain-drenched Seattle, so dry that early settlers had found cacti growing on the open prairies. Harry's shop was right downtown, and the whole family moved into a small apartment above it. 2. Building a new house. Harry bought some farmland outside town and began building a new house by hand. The farmland was rough and raw, covered by hundreds of stumps from the forest that had recently been logged off. Joe and his dad began to dig up the stumps. They dug a ditch to divert water from the nearby Dungeness River to a water wheel that Harry built. The water wheel powered a sawmill that Harry also built. Then he felled some of the few trees still standing on the property and used the lumber to frame a 2-story house. He and Joe collected smooth river rocks from the Dungeness and erected an enormous stone fireplace. The house was still only half completed when Harry sold the shop and moved everyone out to the farm. 3. Joe's school life and friendship with Joyce Sindars. At school, Joe became a popular and successful student. He was a particular favorite of Miss Flatibo, the music teacher. As the years passed, he acquired a collection of old, used stringed instruments, including a mandolin, several guitars, a ukulele, and 2 banjos. He'd play on the front porch after school, patiently mastering each instrument one by one. Soon he took to carrying one of the guitars onto the school bus. He'd sit in the back and play and sing as the other kids gathered around. There was one student in particular, a pretty girl named Joyce Sindars, who seemed to enjoy the music more than the rest. She had blonde curls, a button nose, and a fetching smile. For impact of the Great Depression, a month after Joyce left, disaster struck Wall Street, the financial capital of the business world. The stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. Companies were destroyed across the country. Businesses and family farms collapsed. In Sequim alone, dozens of families simply walked away from their homes and farms, many leaving their dogs behind to fend for themselves. Just a week after the stock market crash, packs of these dogs began appearing daily on the Rantz family farm, chasing the cows, nipping at their legs. Soon the cows were too tired to give milk. 2 weeks later, mink stole into the henhouse and slaughtered dozens of chickens, leaving their bloody corpses piled up in the corners. Joe's family had survived mostly by selling milk and eggs. Now they had little of either. 5 families' departure. Then one rainy afternoon in November, the school bus dropped off Joe just as darkness was enveloping the house. Walking up the driveway, stepping over potholes full of rainwater, Joe noticed his father's car, its engine running. Something was tied to the roof, with a tarp over it. The younger kids were sitting in the back seat, among suitcases, and peering at him through steamy windows. Thula was sitting in the front seat, staring straight ahead. Joe's dad stood on the porch, watching him approach. Joe mounted the porch steps. His father's face was drawn and white. "What's up, Pop? Where are we going?" Joe murmured. Chapter 7. A rare and sacred thing delves into the rigorous training and practice sessions that the University of Washington's freshman crew team underwent. The chapter provides a detailed account of the physical and mental challenges of rowing, the lessons imparted by the coaches, and the experiences of the boys as they prepared to row. 1. Daily practices. Every day after classes, Joe made the long trek down to the lake. He donned his jersey and shorts. He weighed in, like all the boys, so the coaches could make sure they weren't gaining too many extra pounds or training so hard that they lost too much weight. Each shell held 8 rowers, along with a coxswain, a smaller boy who direct their pace and steer the boat. At every practice, the boys were split into training crews, so Joe checked a chalkboard to see which group he was assigned to for the day. 2. Coach Bowles' lessons. The freshman coach, Tom Bowles, began each session with a talk. He changed his topic each day, but Joe had begun to notice 2 common themes. First, the boys heard time and again that rowing was difficult almost beyond imagining. In the months ahead, Bowles said, their bodies and moral characters would be tested. Only those who possessed near superhuman physical endurance and mental toughness would prove good enough to wear a W on their chests. By Christmas break most of them would have given up, Bowles said, perhaps for something less demanding, like football. 3. Training in Old Nero. Once Coach Bowles finished talking each day, they wrestled the long, white-bladed oars from their racks, carried them down to the water, and prepared to row. They were not remotely ready to step into a delicate, 62-foot-long racing shell. They would have capsized it and ended up in the lake. Instead, they waited turns to board the school's training barge, Old Nero. The vessel was wide and flat-bottomed, with a long walkway running down the middle and 8 seats for novice oarsmen on either side. All the rowers faced the back of the boat and sat on small seats that slid back and forth along greased runners. Since 1907, hundreds of hopeful freshmen at the University of Washington had learned the basics of rowing in that old barge. Now it was Joe's turn. For catching a crab, as they tried to absorb the lessons, they lived in constant fear of making any of the many mistakes Coach Bowles kept pointing out to them. One was particularly frightening. If the blade of their oar entered the water too deeply, at the wrong angle, or out of time with the others in their crew, or if it remained in the water too long, the oar would suddenly become stuck. This was known as catching a crab. When it happened, it felt as if some gargantuan crustacean had reached up from the depths and seized the blade. The boat kept moving, but the oar didn't. The boy who caught the crab might be smacked hard in the chest with the handle and knocked out of his seat. Or if he held on to the oar too long, he might be catapulted into the water. Every stroke he took offered each boy the possibility of a wet, cold, and spectacularly public form of humiliation. 5. Roger Morris experience. Out of all the freshmen, the only one who'd ever rowed before was Joe's friend Roger Morris. As a boy, he'd spent his summers rowing a small boat in Manzanita Bay, a lovely blue cove in western Washington. When he was 12 years old, he once rowed 15 miles from his family's cabin outside Seattle to their house in the city, all because he had a terrible toothache and wanted to get home and see his mother. But aboard Old Nero, Roger Morris discovered that his experience was no help. His freewheeling style of rowing was nothing like the precise racing stroke that Coach Bowles was trying to teach. 6. George Yeoman Pocock. The man who shaped the boats, George Yeoman Pocock, was the same mysterious figure who'd been watching the boys so closely since their first meeting. And the reason he'd been studying them was that he knew as much about the fine art of rowing as he did about the art of building shells. Pocock was all but born with an oar in his hands. Raised in England, within sight of some of the finest rowing water in the world, he was descended from a long line of boat builders. His father crafted shells for Eton College, just across the Thames River from Windsor Castle. Gentlemen's sons had been rowing competitively at Eton since the 1790s. At the age of 15, George began working alongside his father, laboring with hand tools to maintain and add to Eton's fleet. But he didn't just build boats, he also learned to row them, and to row them very well. At Eton, the coaches taught the boys to use long strokes, but George came to prefer the quick, powerful rowing style of the men who worked carrying passengers and freight on the Thames River. He adapted their style, inventing a more efficient stroke. Soon George and his brother, Dick, were outracing the aristocratic Eton boys, then giving informal rowing lessons to them after their classes. 7. Hiram Conabeer. One blustery gray day, George looked out the window of the floating workshop and saw a gangly and awkward man with a shock of reddish but graying hair flying in the wind. He was flailing his oars, not making progress in any direction. He looked, George thought, like a bewildered crab. Dick thought he must be drunk. Eventually the brothers snagged the man's boat and dragged it alongside the workshop. When they helped him aboard, he grinned, stuck out a large hand, and boomed out, "My name is Hiram Conabeer. I am the rowing coach at the University of Washington." Conabeer had become Washington's coach because nobody else was available to take the job, not because he knew the first thing about rowing. But he'd heard about the brothers, and he wanted a few of their long, sleek, elegant shells for the team, so he had made the journey to Vancouver. Chapter 8, Going It Alone, delves into the hardships faced by Joe Rantz during his teenage years. The chapter provides a detailed account of Joe's life after his family left him alone in their half-finished house in Sequim, his struggle for survival, and his determination to make his own way in life. 1. Joe's determination. After his family left him alone in their half-finished house in Sequim, 15-year-old Joe woke up to the realization that he was sick and tired of finding himself scared, hurt, and abandoned. He decided that from now on, he would make his own way. He would find his own route to happiness, as his father had said. He'd prove to his father, and to himself, that he could do it. He wasn't going to be a hermit and live completely alone. Friends, he knew, could help him push away the loneliness. But he would never again let himself depend on them, nor on his family, nor on anyone. he would survive, and he would do it on his own. 2. Joe's survival tactics. Over the next few weeks and months, Joe began to fend entirely for himself. He drove iron stakes into the ground to defend the chicken coop against future mink attacks, and treasured the few eggs he gathered every morning. He foraged in the dripping woods for mushrooms, gathered the last of the autumn's blackberries, netted the last of the fish from the pond. He picked watercress for salads. Watercress and berries would only go so far, though. He knew he was going to need some money in his pocket. So he drove downtown in the old Franklin car his father had left behind, parked, and sat on the hood playing his banjo in the rain, hoping for spare change. 3. Joe's work. When he wasn't catching salmon or stealing booze, Joe threw himself into any kind of legitimate work he could find. He dug tunnels under tree stumps in his neighbors' pastures and pried them out of the earth with long iron bars, or packed dynamite under them and blew them sky-high. He stooped and scraped with a shovel, digging irrigation ditches by hand. With a long-handled, double-edged axe, he split fence rails from massive cedar logs. He dug wells and built barns, crawling around in the rafters pounding nails. He lugged 120-pound cans of milk and sweet cream around dairy farms. As summer came on, he labored under pale blue skies in the dry fields, cutting hay, forking it into wagons, and hoisting it by the ton into the lofts of his neighbors' barns. For Joe's music, often now he would take his dinner with the McDonald family, which was better than eating in solitude, sitting at one end of the large table where his family used to gather for boisterous dinners. But at the end of the day, he was always alone, back in the big, empty, half-finished house. Sometimes he plinked at the keys of his mother's old piano and floated simple melodies through the dark, empty spaces of the house, as the lights powered by the water wheel flickered on and off. Later, Joe found a more enjoyable way to make a few dollars when he and 2 of his school friends formed a band. With Joe on the banjo, they played during intermissions at the movie theater and at dances in nearby towns. They seldom made much money, but their performances got them into the theaters and dance halls for free. Chapter 9 part of a single thing delves into the life of Joe Rantz after graduating from high school. The chapter provides a detailed account of Joe's struggles to earn money for college, his relationship with Joyce, and his experiences as part of the University of Washington's freshman crew team. 1. Joe's work. After graduating with honors from Roosevelt High School, Joe returned to Sequim as he'd promised Joyce. He planned to work for a year to scrape together enough money for a year's rent and books and tuition. First, he got a job with the Civilian Conservation Corps, laying asphalt for the new Olympic Highway at 50 cents an hour. The money was decent, but the work was brutal. For 8 hours a day, working under a hot summer sun, he shoveled steaming asphalt out of trucks and raked it out flat in advance of the steamrollers. On weekends, he dug irrigation ditches and cut hay for local farmers. That winter, he went back to cutting down cottonwoods with Charlie McDonald. All of the work was hard, but there was a saving grace. Joyce was in her last year of high school, and when she got off the bus each day, she would rush through the woods. 70 years later, as an old woman, she would remember how when she hugged him, he smelled of wet wood and the sweet wildness of the outdoors. 2. Joe's proposal to Joyce. One radiant day in late April, he led her through a cottonwood grove to a small meadow on the bank of the Dungeness. Joe loved to find 4-leaf clovers for Joyce. She was mystified at how easily he found them, but he always told her that it wasn't a matter of luck at all. The trick was simply keeping your eyes open. "The only time you don't find a 4-leaf clover," he liked to say, "is when you stop looking for one." When he told her to sit and wait for a moment, she figured he was looking for one of those tokens of his affection. After a short while, shorter than usual, Joe returned. "Found one," he said, beaming. He held out a closed fist, and she reached out to receive the clover. But as he slowly unfolded his hand, she saw that it held not a clover, but a golden ring with a small, but perfect diamond sparkling in the rare spring sunshine. 3. Joe's Crew Selection. On the afternoon of November 28th, the last practice day of the fall term, the freshmen took one final, frigid workout. When the last boat had returned to the shell house, Coach Bowles told the boys to stick around. He said that it was time to announce who had made the first and second boats. Then he ducked into Ulbrichson's office. The boys glanced at one another. Most of those who had kept rowing through the fall were working-class boys like Joe and Roger. Through the steamy windowpanes of the glassed-in office, they could see the two coaches hunched over a desk in their flannel suits, studying a piece of paper. Now that the rainy season had begun, the shell house reeked sourly of sweat and damp socks and mildew. The wind shook the massive sliding door. As the two coaches lingered, the normally talkative boys turned uncomfortably silent. The only sound was a soft tapping. Up in the loft at the back of the room, Pocock was nailing together the frame for a new shell. Roger Morris drifted over and stood quietly next to Joe, toweling his hair dry. Finally, Coach Bowles emerged from the office and climbed up onto a bench, clutching the piece of paper. The boys shuffled into a semicircle around him. He began by saying that this selection was not final. All of them could continue to compete for the seats he was about to announce. Nobody should get all swell-headed just because he heard his name called out now. Nobody should think he was a sure thing. There wasn't any such animal. Then he began to read off the names on the list. He moved first through the assignments for the second boat. When Coach Bowles finished, Joe glanced at Roger. His friend was staring morosely down at the floor. Neither of them had been called. Then Coach Bowles began calling out the first boat assignments. Bow seat, Roger Morris. Number 2 seat, Shorty Hunt. Number 3 seat, Joe Rantz. As Bowles continued, Joe clenched his fist at his side and gave it a subtle little pump. Next to him, Roger began to exhale softly. For Joe's emotional moment, as the rest of the boys headed for the showers, those selected for the first boat took a shell barge off its rack, hoisted it over their heads, and marched it down to the darkening lake for a celebratory row. A light but cutting wind ruffled the water. As the sun set, they began to row westward, seeking the calmer waters of Lake Union. The temperature had fallen into the upper 30s, and it felt even colder on the water. Joe hardly noticed. As the boat slipped onto the surface of Lake Union, the noise of city traffic fell away, and he entered into a world completely silent except for the rhythmic barking of the coxswain, calling out their pace from the stern. Joe's seat slid methodically and silently back and forth on the greased runners beneath him. His arms and legs pulled and pushed smoothly, almost easily. When the white blade of his oar entered the black water, it did not splash. It just murmured. At the north end of the lake, the coxswain called out, "Way, 'nuff!" The boys stopped rowing. The shell glided to a stop, the long oars trailing in the water alongside them. The boys sat without talking, breathing heavily, exhaling plumes of white breath in the darkness. Even now that they had stopped rowing, their breathing was synchronized, and for a brief, fragile moment it seemed to Joe as if all of them were part of a single thing, something alive with breath and spirit of its own. Joe gulped huge draughts of the frigid air and sat staring at the city lights in the distance, the amber lights of downtown, the ruby-red lights of radio towers, the green lights on docks along the shore. He watched the scene turn into a soft blur of colors as tears filled his eyes. For the first time since his family had left him, Joe began to cry. He turned his face to the water, fiddling with his oarlock so the others would not see. He didn't know where the tears had come from, what they were all about. But something inside him had shifted, if only for a few moments. Chapter 10. A broken machine delves into the rigorous training and practice sessions that the University of Washington's freshman crew team underwent. The chapter provides a detailed account of the physical and mental challenges of rowing, the lessons imparted by the coaches, and the experiences of the boys as they prepared to row. Here are some stories from Chapter 10. 1. Joe's return to Seattle. In January, after a trip back to Sequim for Christmas break, Joe and Joyce returned to Seattle. When crew practice started up on January 8th, Joe and the 17 other boys in the first and second freshman boats learned that they could now abandon the shell barges and step for the first time into proper racing shells, the sleek and lovely cedar crafts built by George Pocock. 2. Training schedule. They also learned that what had seemed a brutal workout schedule in the fall was merely a whisper of what the coaches had in mind for them now. In the next few months, they were told, they would race mostly against one another and the upperclassmen on the team. Joe's spot was not guaranteed. Nobody's was. The boys would continue to fight for the top 8 seats. In mid-April, just one boatload of freshmen would face their primary rival, the University of California at Berkeley, right here on Lake Washington. If they prevailed in that race, and only if they did so, they would likely earn a chance to compete against the elite Eastern schools for the National Freshman Championship in June. The whole season would come down to just 2 major races. 3. Rowing in harsh weather. It was a cold, wet winter in Seattle. Day after day it rained, but day after day they rowed anyway. They rowed through cutting wind, bitter sleet, and occasional snow well into the dark of night. They rowed with cold rainwater running down their backs, pooling in the bottom of the boat, and sloshing back and forth under their sliding seats. It was nearly as wet above the surface of the lake as below. Through it all, Bowles followed them back and forth across Lake Washington, riding through the slop and chop in the open cockpit of his brass-trimmed, mahogany-planked motorboat, the Alumnus. Wearing a bright yellow rain slicker, he bellowed commands at them through his megaphone until his voice grew hoarse and his throat sore. For Joe's struggles, one potential weak link seemed to be Joe Rantz. Coach Bowles had tried moving Joe back and forth between the number 3 seat and number 7, but with no effect. The problem looked to be technical. From the beginning of tryouts, Bowles had not been able to get Joe to square up consistently. To square up, a rower has to rotate his oar so that the blade is perpendicular to the surface just before he inserts it into the water on the catch, the beginning of each stroke. If the angle is wrong, the rower cannot produce enough power, and the whole boat suffers a loss of speed. Squaring up requires strong wrists, and Joe just couldn't seem to get the hang of it. Beyond that, his stroke was generally eccentric. He rowed powerfully but decidedly in his own way, and his own way looked to be largely ineffective. 5. Joe's realization. Bowles didn't know the answer, but for Joe, the brief incident was a sudden and cold reminder. He could easily lose his position on the crew. His place at the university was not secure either. Everything he had worked for could be over on any given afternoon. The end. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like and share. See you in next videos.